Good evening. Today we are going to channel Marvin Gaye, and I'm going to need your help. Go back with me to 1971 when Marvin Gaye released the critically acclaimed song, What's Going On. Now that song talked about issues such as poverty, drugs, the political unrest, the differences in social economic climates, and the distrust of the police system. Now come back with me to 2015, and we're still talking about those same issues. What's going on in America today? Today, I have my special friend and guest, attorney Russell Wilson. And on Access to Justice, we're going to be talking about those issues. What's going on, particularly in the criminal justice system. I'm attorney Delia Parker Mims. Thank you for watching. Russell, it's been a while since we've had a chance to sit down and talk, hasn't it?
It certainly has, and it's outstanding to be here with you today. And thank you so much for having me. And I'm certainly excited to talk about what's going on.
Well, you remember that song, right?
Oh, man, I can't forget it. It was a remarkable song. I remember driving around on my campus in college playing it. I remember my mom and dad playing it. It's etched in my mind. I even have a Marvin Gaye T-shirt.
Yes. Now we were little babies. I might have been running a little bit faster than you. I think I might be a minute or two older than you. But we were little babies. But that song, because of its impact and the amount and what it means on the culture, was very important then. And it's interesting how it's very much still relevant today.
Yes. No, it is. It is. You know, when you think of Marvin Gaye in the early '70s and the events that were occurring. The Vietnam War and all the political unrest. And you see a lot of that reflected today, whether you look at Ferguson and the issues that we've had there. Certainly in New York, there have been a number of political issues. And then even in a broader spectrum, when we see what's going on worldwide as the evil eye of terrorism continues to rise. And so we're taking on a lot of challenges as a society that makes us say, you know, what is going on?
Yeah, and why is it still going on? Okay, now, before we get into our philosophical discussion, and neither one of us will have an answer as to what's going on, but, you know, we'll talk about it from our opinion as attorneys in the process. First, let's talk a little bit about you and your background, because you and I, we've known each other since maybe when we first were new attorneys running around in the 90s.
Right.
And since then, you've built quite a resume for yourself, particularly in the area of criminal law. So you practice in Dallas and Denton, and you've had a kind of a rather unique perspective on criminal law and criminal justice from the prosecutor point of view, as well as from the defense attorney point of view. So let's tell the viewer something about yourself, so when they understand why your opinion means so much to me, and it should mean a little bit to them.
Well, certainly. Well, this is my 20th year of practice, and I'm board certified in criminal law. I've been board certified since 2003. You will remember that less than 1% of attorneys in the state of Texas are board certified in criminal law. And I've tried cases in state and federal court throughout not only the state of Texas, but other states as well.
Let's, hold on, board certified. Let's give a few moments on that. Explain what exactly does that mean and how that distinguishes you. It's not just something you put after your name.
Well, you know, in order to become board certified, you have to, one, have the recommendations of colleagues and judges that you have appeared before. You have to complete a very challenging written exam. And then what it does is give you a certification or ability to say that you specialize in a particular area of law. So 2003, now, you know, years ago, I took the exam and I passed. And so I'm board certified in criminal law, along with a very small group of attorneys in the area.
Okay. And we'll go on to some of your more recent things that you've been into, so that we can get into our philosophical discussion and channel Marvin Gaye. You recently worked with the Dallas Attorney's Office, District Attorney's Office. What was your capacity in that position?
I was the Special Fields Bureau Chief at the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. I worked with Craig Watkins, who was the first African-American elected to District Attorney in the history of the state of Texas. I supervised a unit that he created, which was called the Conviction Integrity Unit. And the main function of the Conviction Integrity Unit was to review claims of actual innocence. Those were claims where people were in prison for crimes that they didn't commit, and they were claiming that they were actually innocent. During my time in the unit, we exonerated at least 12 people, and overall the unit exonerated more than 34 people. And we spoke nationally and locally on matters that impacted criminal justice directly.
So when you say you exonerated, these were individuals who had already been convicted and were already serving time for crimes that your unit later determined they didn't actually commit. Is that correct?
Right. No, they had gone to prison, and for lack of a better term, the key had been thrown away. Having had the experience of seeing firsthand injustices, we knew that there were people in prison who were there for crimes that they did not commit. Mm-hmm. And so when you were in the district attorney's office, you're in a unique position to critically evaluate criminal convictions. And what we were able to do in those cases, sometimes with DNA and sometimes without it, was establish as a matter of law that these people were not guilty of the crimes that they had been convicted of.
How did you pick your cases?
Well, we used a screening technique which basically relies upon prior acknowledged flaws in the criminal justice system. So, for example, if we knew that a show-up identification was inherently unreliable, then that might be a factor that would make it more likely that this case was a wrongful identification case. If we knew that techniques that were used to get a statement from a witness were inherently unreliable, we then went back and questioned, the validity of those statements. And so you use a number of different techniques. Part of it is just knowing what causes wrongful convictions, and then the other part of it is just recognizing that when you're reviewing a case.
Okay. Now, one other thing I want to discuss and let the viewers understand about your background before we get into those issues is the issue of grand juries. What does that mean? And then what's your background with what a grand jury is?
Grand juries are as old as the law itself. And they are formed and initially were formed for the purposes of determining whether or not to return an indictment against a person. Grand juries are made up of members of the community, but they are not necessarily, there's not a particular requirement other that they be a member of the community, not have a felony conviction. They are permitted to deliberate in secret and make decisions as to whether or not to return indictments in criminal cases. Prosecutors are permitted to be present in the grand jury, but defense attorneys and defendants are not permitted.
Okay. So in a nutshell, the grand jury is the process by which the community determines if a person is going to have a felony indictment and then be forced to have to go and stand trial for that felony.
Right,
so
exactly.
Even before they are in front of a jury to determine their guilt or innocence, a grand jury would look at the facts of the situation and determine whether or not they should even be charged. Is that correct?
Right. Well, yes, but one of the things that people have to keep in mind is that in large part, grand juries take what I would call cursory glances. For example, a grand jury could hear in one particular day 30 or 40 cases. And given that amount of time, that volume of cases and that limited amount of time, they may be doing a 5-minute reading of a police offense report. So full-blown trials don't happen in grand juries. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, today is not the day of old, and there's a lot of room for improvement in our grand jury system and a lot of need for change in our grand jury system.
And we'll talk about that. But I think what I'm hearing you say and want the viewers to understand is that the grand jury process is not the same standard of guilt or innocence that a person would have when they have a trial. So even if a person is indicted by the grand jury or they find that there's some reason to believe we should go forward, that's not any indication of whether or not the allegation is true or not true.
Right. There's an old saying that used to go that you could indict a ham sandwich. There's literally there's not necessarily in the grand jury process a testing of the credibility, if you will, and there's not a vetting that can be done in a criminal case. Like I said, defendant doesn't have a right to be there, doesn't have a right to cross-examine anybody, doesn't even have a right to make any type of presentation.
Okay. Now, in your background, you talked a little bit about your role as working with the district attorney's office, the criminal district attorney's office. Prior to that, you were in private practice, and now you're back in private practice. And what I like to say about criminal defense attorneys is they are the last defender of the Constitution. I don't personally practice in criminal law, I do juvenile law, but I do understand that concept, which sometimes a lot of people have trouble wrapping around, how and why you would want to be a criminal defense attorney. But that's what you're doing now, is that correct?
Right, and it's an absolute joy to be a criminal defense attorney, and calling us the last defenders of the law is kind of a sad state of the day, because what you've got to understand is if you've ever been accused of something, not even anything criminal, accused of something that you didn't do, or something where you were facing a penalty or punishment for something you didn't do, then the last person that you would want in the world was somebody who was opposed to you, somebody who couldn't come in and support you. And so what criminal defense attorneys do is ensure the workings of our systems. Mm-hmm. If there's accusations from those grand juries that I just talked about, somebody has to assist people in being able to respond to those, and that's our job. And
right.
it's a job I take a lot of pride in, and there's been no greater joy than returning to somebody a freedom which was unjustly snatched from them by a system that failed them. And so
right.
as a criminal defense attorney, you go out each day knowing that that's a heavy burden and a strong obligation, and I take it on excitedly.
Okay. Now, at Access to Justice, we seek to talk about topics that promote accessibility, understanding, and eliminate barriers to justice. And so today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to channel Marvin Gaye and talk about what's going on. We
Right.
mentioned some of the words that we've heard in recent time on the television, that being grand jury and indictments, not returning an indictment, all of the things that Attorney Russell Wilson is very familiar with and has experience doing. Now, as we look at 2015 and we go back to 2014 and this time period that is still as tumultuous as it was in 1971, which is an unfortunate state, let's talk about some of the things and explain the process that happened so our viewers understand when they're seeing these on TV. And we're going to, unfortunately, we'll start with Michael Brown.
All right.
And as you recall, that was the Ferguson, Missouri
Right.
case,
Right.
where the young man who did not have a weapon was killed by a police officer. And we're finding that those incidences are kind of happening more and more often. And we're wondering, what does it mean when the police officer is not indicted? And what is your take on that situation?
Personally, with respect to that situation, I disagreed with the outcome of the situation. When a police officer is not indicted, a grand jury has, based off of what they've been presented, made a determination that there was not probable cause to believe that the police officer's acts were criminal. That doesn't always impact civil suits, and sometimes you have to worry about the information that a grand jury was or was not presented, and that's controlled primarily by the prosecutor in the case. In Michael Brown's case, it seemed very clear from any reasonable account that there were alternatives other than shooting an unarmed person. And, society has to give some critical thought to these circumstances. On the one hand, we certainly expect our police officers to serve and protect, and we are not asking them to sacrifice their lives unnecessarily. at the same time, we can't have them hypersensitive to alleged acts of aggression such that they respond with such overwhelming force that they cause the death of the children of tomorrow.
Okay.
And so,
and part of that problem with the Ferguson, or I won't use the word problem, but part of the discussion regarding the grand jury was whether or not it was conducted appropriately. Did you do any background research, or have you read any of the transcripts from that?
I did. I read some of the transcripts, and I think this grand jury deviated from all other grand juries. One, in the breadth of information that they were attempting to take in, and it sounded like they tried to have a trial in the grand jury, where you're recalling witnesses multiple times, things of that nature. And I think that the grand jury was misused in that case. But I'm not so sure that in that community, at that time with that particular grand jury, that they ever would have returned an indictment against the officer, because our beliefs on some core issues may be so far apart that they're never going to be able to see things the same way that I see them.
Okay, and when you mention are we talking race? Is that what you're saying? When you base your belief system, what is the denominator?
I associate the belief system more with education and economics. Mm-hmm. I don't like to think that I necessarily have a view because I am black. I'd rather believe that it was because I've been exposed, or I've read and seen other things. And I think in that small town that they may not have had the exposure and information that I've seen. And the town, the police force was predominantly non-African American to begin with, so they were existing in an atmosphere that was receptive to essentially what I would deem segregation, where the white police force was pretty much regulating the black community. I would have had an issue with that to begin with prior to the shooting. So, I wouldn't have trusted any criminal case coming from a force that was assimilated in that way, because it was not designed to protect and serve the entire community, but it would seem like it was designed to protect and serve just the people that assembled the force. And so, we were coming from different philosophical standpoints.
Right. Now, I think the Department of Justice may have recently looked into Ferguson in Missouri and determined that there's a little bit of overreach and overbreadth in terms of the police force and their interactions with the African American community. Now, as a result of that, there's been some talk about how do we move forward and how do we curtail some of these things that are going on with the police force. You mentioned maybe earlier that you, in your role, have been involved in officer-involved shootings.
I have.
And in your role in that capacity, do you think some of the suggestions, such as the police officers wearing video cameras on their person or microphones as they move around, do you think that would provide another level of protection and integrity to the process?
I think it will add another level of accountability. It depends on who that camera is on at the end of the day. If you put a body camera on a person who's determined to do wrong, you're likely just going to see them do wrong because they're going to act out of their value system. I think that the cameras can capture more often than not what we are seeing or hearing. And so these situations where there's disputes about what was said will certainly be resolved. But the core issue of how you respond to these situations, how you increase training, how you de-escalate societal tension, I don't think is necessarily going to change with the body camera. Those are deeper issues. This just gives us accountability. This gives us a view from the standpoint of the officer as it unfolds. I certainly think that it is part of a solution, but the problem is bigger than just placing body cameras on police officers.
What do you think part of the solution could be?
Well, I think you've got to have a police force that is experienced at interacting with all members of the community. And so if you have a community, let's say San Francisco, with a strong Asian population, a strong Hispanic population are strong. You need to be able to go across these cultural barriers in ways that your communication lines are open. You cannot be always seen as the person who's coming in and delivering the bad news or bringing the damage. And I think Dallas has certainly made strides in that area with community policing models, interactive community policing models. And I encourage all law enforcement agencies in the state of Texas to do the same thing.
What is community policing models? What is that?
Well, that's a situation where you're coming into the community as your law enforcement officers, and you are seeking to have contact. For example, you go to organizational meetings. You may reach out to the church. Generally, society prefers law enforcement. You know, we want a society where we're safe in our homes, where our cars aren't broken into, and we don't walk down the street with fear. But the problem becomes that if you're not interacting regularly and your sole purpose in a community is an adverse contact, then the only reason that you are there is to create something hostile. That escalates tension, and that leads to situations where you can have a hypervigilant police officer use force that's not necessary.
Have you done any research on whether or not the number of those types of shootings have increased, or are we just hearing more about it because of our access to social media?
Yeah, you know, I have, and I haven't seen anything that says that there's a large increase in these types of shootings. I think we're hearing more about it because of our access to social media. I think we're much more aware of it, and there are more frequent instances where individuals that are shot, are killed, are unarmed. And so we're starting to bring about this questioning as to whether or not we should train our officers. How are they responding in those situations? And so, you know, the media has done a great job of bringing this social justice issue to the forefront.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Do you think it's possible to want to have that type of transparency and accountability with law enforcement and still be a supporter of law enforcement?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, the thing about it is this, you know, the great thing about America is that this is a land of the people. And of the people, in my mind, means accountability and transparency. So whatever you're doing in law enforcement in regards to training police officers on interacting with people in the United States should be transparent. There shouldn't be anything that you're doing that you're afraid to tell us or show us. And if you can have a law enforcement that engages in that way, then people have to trust them. And then if there's issues in training and approaches, then you've got to be open to changing it. Because at the end of the day, what law enforcement has to do is accept that it's the people that make these determinations, the same people that you are there to protect, that can determine how far is too far and how far is not far enough.
Okay. And you're mentioning about the community involvement. That's always a good way for there to build bridges between law enforcement and the community so we can begin to talk about those issues.
Right. No, I mean, you know, not only discussion, but also action. That you've got to recognize if you're sitting around believing that you can continue to use policing tactics that were used when Marvin Gaye's song came out, then you've got to recognize you can't do that anymore. That you've got to change how you do things, and that if you don't change, you're going to force an increase in societal tension, which can result in people acting out in terrible ways against our men and women who are on a daily basis, you know, risking their lives for our protection.
Exactly. And there doesn't have to be mutually exclusive that we support law enforcement, but we also want to promote accessibility, accountability, and transparency within our law enforcement departments, because we don't want a police state and the contrary.
You know, in supporting law enforcement has never meant a refusal to criticize law enforcement. Just like anybody in your family, if you see them doing something wrong, the better thing is to say something about it. And so by being critical of law enforcement doesn't mean that you don't support them. When you call, and if you have an emergency tonight, by all means, you should be calling 911.
Exactly.
But if they fail to meet your expectations, though, you're right, and your destiny should be to let them know that they failed, and their job is to try to hear those concerns and make better efforts in the future.
And so we can move beyond it and maybe come up with a new song that we represent and not the same one from 1971, 44 years ago. We're getting close to the end of our show, so we come to a part where I call closing statement, which I'm going to allow you to have a minute or so to give some closing statements to the viewers. Let them know about yourself or some thoughts that you may have. But as a viewer, you might want to get a pen and pencil ready so that at the end of the show, if you want to be able to contact Attorney Russell Wilson, his phone number and contact information will appear on the screen, as well as you will be able to contact me at Parker Legal Center. So have a pen and pencil ready. So go ahead and have your opportunity for your closing statement.
All right. Well, I would tell our viewers, one, don't take the challenges of today as setbacks, but take them as opportunities. We live in a great country, a great society, and it's your involvement in society that is critical to our success. I happen to work in the criminal defense area, in the criminal law field, but I'm motivated and energized about every day coming into contact with exciting people of all colors, all races, all economic backgrounds, and being able to engage in efforts to improve our society. I'm happy to provide legal services if you so happen to need them, but my biggest hope is that you don't need them, that you make decisions that are smart decisions beforehand, and you avoid being in those situations where you're faced with a criminal charge. But if you are faced with a criminal charge, I will vigorously defend you, insist upon every right being validated, recognized, and accepted by a reviewing court, and I've done that for 20 years. And I look forward to doing it for 20 more years. And I wish them the best in 2015.
All right. Well, thank you, Attorney Russell Wilson. And as I said at the end of the show, get a pen and pencil and you'll be able to find his contact information. Now, I will take what's called the final argument, so we close out the show, and just tell you a little bit about some of the thoughts that I have regarding this issue. I agree with Mr. Wilson. We hope you never have to contact a criminal attorney to defend yourself against charges that are not true. But if you do, you certainly want to have one who understands and appreciates that our Constitution allows someone to be considered innocent until they are proven guilty. And so that's an important process to go through. You also might want to contact me at Parker Legal Center. Again, at the end of the show, you will see our contact information so that you will be able to get in touch with us. If there are topics that you would like to discuss and have us to review, let us know. Our goal here is to bring accessibility, information, and understanding to the legal system, and it shouldn't have to cost just to do that. Now, as a final thought, I'm going to channel Marvin Gaye. I'm going to save everyone the singing, which I don't do very well, but the sentiments are still there. It's 2015, and in 1971, he was asking what was going on and saying of picket lines, picket signs, don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so that we can see what's going on. And he says, you know, we have to find a way to bring some loving here today. Now, he said that better than I've said it, but we certainly do need to find a way to bring more love and understanding within our culture and with each other. Now, for Access to Justice, I'm Delia Parker Mims, and may God bless and keep you always. Thank you for watching.